Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Hillary Papendick, and I'm the Climate Change Program Manager for the County of San Mateo's Office of Sustainability. And we're really excited tonight to have our first community meeting on the South Coast Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan. We're looking forward to sharing the results with you and having discussion around sea level rise and the impacts on the South Coast. I first want to acknowledge that we have Supervisor Don Horsley with us tonight. We'll first be going over the agenda, and then I will turn it over to him for some opening remarks. So for today's agenda, we are going to be starting with a study overview and then a description of the assessment results by sector by our consultant, Integral Consulting. And Integral will also be going over the adaptation plan, and this is a part of the study. Following the overview of all of the results and the adaptation plan, we'll be dividing up into 2 breakout rooms to discuss the results and then hear from you all about your ideas for what we should focus on for adaptation. And then we'll come back and talk and wrap up and do next steps. So thank you again for joining. We're excited to have an information-filled evening and to hear from you all. So I'll now turn it over to Supervisor Horsley. Open, you're on mute.
Thanks, Hillary. It is kind of an exciting evening, so thank you all of us for on behalf of all of us for joining to discuss what sea level rise means for the South Coast. I've been involved in sea level rise efforts at the county since 2014. And until now, there's been really a big gap in the county sea level rise assessment for the area south of Half Moon Bay. So tonight, we will be sharing the preliminary results of the study and discuss the potential solutions to the challenge of sea level rise. This study builds on numerous efforts to address flooding in the Pescadero and South Coast efforts. And just to give you a few examples, now first and foremost, and one of the things that I'm actually proudest of is the Pescadero dredge and the impact on flooding in the town of Pescadero. That effort was led by the RCD, or Resource Conservation District. The other thing that we are doing is we're moving the fire station, number 59, to the Pescadero High School site to get it out of the floodplain. And then the last, not the last thing, but another really kind of, I think, creative thing was the creation of the Flood and Sea Level Rise Resiliency District. This new district is really the first of its kind in the entire state. So as we gather here today in July at the tail end of a record-breaking heat wave in the Northwest and with drought conditions well underway, especially on the South Coast, it may seem strange to talk about flooding. However, we've already experienced 8 inches of sea level rise, and taking steps to prepare our communities for sea level rise will take time and lots of education for our communities as well. So I look forward to hearing your ideas for protecting the South Coast communities, beaches, parks, and open space on Highway 1 and the farms from flooding and erosion impacts. And so just a little bit of background and what we have done. In 2018, Sea Level Change, San Mateo County released a sea level rise vulnerability assessment for the entire bayshore from the North Coast, in other words, Half Moon Bay North. And then with new data from the U.S. Geological Survey, the county is working with the San Mateo County, again, that Resource Conservation District, which is a small but very mighty organization, and our consultant, Integral, and to complete the last phase of the county sea level rise vulnerability assessment for the South Coast of the county from Half Moon Bay all the way to the county line, Santa Cruz County line. The South Coast of San Mateo County is really known for its beaches. It's probably overly too loved, in fact, because of its beaches and parks and open space. And the ocean views and the closeness communities of the farms and redwood forest that are really scenic State Highway 1. And oftentimes parts of scenic Highway 1 are in danger of collapse. So that is another example of the potential, the reason for really studying sea level rise and its impact on the South Coast. In any case, the county has worked in collaboration with the U.S. Geological Survey and incorporated to develop maps of areas affected by sea level rise, storms, and erosion. And we are working with scientists, agencies, and community members to collect data on assets like farms, roads, and parks that might be at risk from sea level rise and from flooding. And in this process, we're developing a set of solutions to sea level rise risk for key assets, resources, and key issues for communities and ecosystems such as Pescadero Marsh, as well as the cost of not planning for sea level rise. And for community outreach, which is, I think, incredibly incredible, and that really something that really has got to be part and parcel of this whole process, we're going to reach out to the community this summer and fall to share the preliminary results of the assessment and discuss potential adaptation solutions. The information and community-focused solutions developed through the plan will be critical for the county's local hazard mitigation plan, which is really currently underway. The plan will help the county and its partners prepare for floods and landslides and ensure that we are building in places protected from these hazards. And with that, I will turn it back to Hillary.
Great, thank you, Supervisor Horsley. And I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Isabel Perez, to talk more about some of the county's efforts and the study background.
Great, thanks, Larry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Perez, and I work with the climate change team at the County Office of Sustainability, which is leading this study on the South Coast Sea Level Rise vulnerability assessment. And before we dive into the results of this study, I just wanted to provide some context for the study. Here you see a list of some of the efforts currently underway at the county related to climate change. And like Supervisor Horsley mentioned, we are updating the county local hazard mitigation plan, which looks at how the county and its cities and special districts can reduce the impact of natural hazards, such as earthquakes and heat and wildfires, but also includes climate change and sea level rise. So we really have the opportunity to include actions and project ideas in this plan in order to apply for FEMA funds from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And that will help us get grants and support to implement sea level rise adaptation solutions countywide. So that's why it's so important to hear your ideas tonight for how we can minimize the risks of sea level rise and other coastal impacts in our coastal communities. We have other sea level rise adaptation efforts, including the county sea level rise policy to protect county facilities adopted in 2019. And you can find more information about these initiatives in our website. I will share the link in the chat shortly. Next slide, please. Like Supervisor mentioned, the South Coast Sea Level Rise study is actually an addition to the county-wide sea level rise vulnerability assessment that was completed in 2019. And that included the rest of the coastal cities and jurisdictions in the county, including Half Moon Bay North. You also are gonna find the full report in our website, seachangesmc.org. But back then, we didn't have sea level rise modeling for the South Coast of the county. So this study comes to fill that gap. Next slide, I'm gonna provide some short overview of the study. So the area that the study covers includes the southern portion of Half Moon Bay to the county line south of Pescadero. And this area covers approximately 35 miles of shoreline. And the study looks at existing and future coastal hazards that could affect this area, including not only sea level rise, but cliff and dune erosion, storm wave impacts, floodings, and how this may change in the future as we see the sea level rising. The final report will provide some information on the different coastal hazards, how they might affect community resources and other important sectors on our coast, like agriculture, parks, recreation, and transportation. And we will begin to identify adaptation strategies and solutions to reduce the risk to sea level rise along the coastline. In terms of the timeline, we have completed the data analysis and mapping all the hazards, and today we will share the results with you to answer your questions about the maps and to start the conversation about adaptation solutions. And we will have a plan available for public review this fall, so stay tuned for our website for updates. Next slide, please. I want to recognize our partners, RCD, the Resource Conservation District, for helping with outreach for this project. We are organizing community events to share this information with the public. And next week, we have a meeting in Spanish in collaboration with South Coast Sustainable and Puente to hear from the Latino community. And I hope that many of you had the chance to watch the beautiful video that we created to raise awareness about this project. And guess where you can find it? In our website. I will put the link on the chat so you can go check it out. And with that, I will pass the mic to Dave and Matt from Integral Consulting to present the results of the vulnerability assessment. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm David Revel. I'm a coastal geologist consultant working with the county on this, trying to provide the technical support. And the sun's winking at me here. There we go. And then my colleague Matt Jameson is also with us, and he'll be facilitating one of the breakout groups. He's been responsible for a lot of the mapping and data analysis as part of this project. So I wanted to start off just kind of giving us a lay of the land of what we've been focusing on. We've really been focusing on looking at different sea level rise scenarios. So we've been looking at what existing coastal hazards might create today if we had a large wave event or an extreme storm. Then we look at a 0.8 feet, which is around a 2030 timeline. But you'll note that there's between 2030 and 2050, it could occur. 1.6 feet could be between 2050 and 2070. And then 4.9 feet, which could occur as early as 2070 and go to 2100. The reason that there's ranges in these estimates, and the reason why we're focusing on elevations of sea level rise, is because we don't know how fast the ice sheets are going to melt when all the glaciers will melt, how warm the ocean will get, and how much greenhouse gases we will continue to emit over time. All of these things create, sort of ranges in when these impacts may occur. So what we're doing is looking at sort of sea level rise elevations, but sea level rise itself is unlikely to cause major damages. What we're worried about is really the coastal hazards that cause erosion today and how they will be increased over time. So we'll be looking at coastal erosion, both to the dunes and cliffs, wave flooding from a 1% annual chance storm or a 100-year wave event. This is sort of what FEMA currently maps for flood insurance purposes. We'll be looking at future tidal inundation of extreme monthly high tides, as well as things that happen every summer and fall season. A closed lagoon flooding. When Pescadero Marsh closes, the water fills like a bathtub and can cause flooding inland. All of these estuaries along the San Mateo County south coast can close and create upland flooding. As sea level rises, we anticipate that these flood extents will increase inland. So we've looked at those. And then we've also looked at a combined coastal creek flooding. So right now, Pescadero, for example, has already experienced watershed or creek flooding along Butano and Pescadero creeks. And as sea level rises and raises the waters at the bottom of the watershed, those coastal creek flood extents will also expand. And so we've considered this combined sea level rise and coastal creek flooding. Again, we're not just looking at the current sea level rise, we're considering tides, king tides, what happens with storms, waves, and storm surge. And then we're looking at different times in the future. So we provide the 0.8 feet to look at a short-term change, maybe in the next 20 years. And then we look at a 50-year change and then an 80-year change to try and give the county and the communities tools to begin to adapt and reduce the risk to the things that we've identified are vulnerable. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail, but I really wanted to clarify that you'll see a lot of maps tonight, and there'll be a lot of maps available in the future associated with this report. What we've done is start to look at how cliff erosion will accelerate. We've measured how current cliff erosion has historically reacted. We've accelerated those rates into the future and started to map where or project where they may get to. And so what we're mapping is a future cliff edge into the future for the cliff erosion. And for dune erosion, which can occur really in a very large wave event, what we've looked at is not only the impact of a major storm wave event eroding sand dunes, but also what happens as sea level rises and slowly eats away at the base of the dunes and moves it inland. So we have several different models that we've utilized to map erosion hazards. And you'll also see in the blues the sort of episodic, such as a major wave event or major flood event on the creeks and rivers, as well as something that might seasonally happen, like when the lagoon mouths close and it feels like a bathtub, creating inland flooding. In order to really look at the communities along the South Coast, we broke it into sectors, and they're really land use, facilities and communities, transportation and parking, parks and recreation, and agriculture. We're also working on some habitat analysis, particularly in Pescadero Marsh, and an economic assessment associated with all of these different sectors. Those are still in progress, and there will be much more information available in the draft report coming out in the fall. You will see a wide variety of vulnerability maps throughout this presentation and in the report that will be available shortly online for everybody to look into. We really have set them up because we're looking at so many different coastal hazards. We have combined them into a single extent. So so what we're mapping in these vulnerability maps is really combined hazard map. So it includes coastal erosion, the lagoon flooding, the creek flooding, and the wave run-up flood hazards. We have, for each of the sectors, this is an example of structures at risk. We have color-coded each of the structures based on the timing of the initial impact. So the purple color is something that could flood today. And along Pescadero Road, if you live in Pescadero, you've observed those already occurring in many cases. The red, it represents the 0.8 feet of sea level rise. The orange represents the 1.6 feet of sea level rise, and the 4.9 feet represents sort of a longer term sea level rise impacts. The colors are coded from dark to present day flooding, getting lighter as you get to 4.9 feet of sea level rise. So you'll see here, like for example, with these structures here, the color is relatively white, but those are, and they're color coded based on that 4.9 feet of sea level rise. So I want to jump into the results. I will start off because the county, this study represents 34 miles of coastline. It's really hard to encapsulate all of them on a single map. So we've broken them into 3 different maps: a north coast, a central coast, including the community of Pescadero, and the south coast, which goes all the way down to the Santa Cruz County line. There's a lot of detail in these maps. Again, I just explained what these colors mean. And then the legend also indicates sort of what we are mapping here. These are examples from the land use category, where we've identified some major impacts to the Martins Beach community and to potentially the Ritz-Carlton and the northern part. In the central part, we're looking at impacts to Pescadero and some of the homes along the ocean front west side of Highway 1, and various facilities and houses along the ocean side of Highway 1. So with 4.9 feet of sea level rise, the analysis shows 123 structures are at risk of damage, mostly due to coastal erosion. There are several significant facilities. The Pescadero Cal Fire Station, which Supervisor Horsley has already identified, and the county is already taking steps to relocate. The Pescadero Corporation Maintenance Yard, which has some maintenance facilities. The Pigeon Point Lighthouse, Gazos Creek Gas Station and Brewery, and the Ritz-Carlton. And again, those are with 4.9 feet of sea level rise. Some of them are already at risk, such as the Cal Fire Station. Others, like the Ritz-Carlton, are not exposed or projected to be exposed until we see much more sea level rise and coastal erosion occurring. This is an example of some of the maps you'll find in the report, illustrating the projections of existing 0.8, 1.6, and 4.9 feet of erosion and the impacts on some of these facilities. So within Pescadero, there's 27 parcels that are potentially affected, about 30 acres of developed land and about 120 acres of agriculture, 33 primary structures, 11 single-family residential, 11 agricultural properties, a mixed-use shop warehouse, and some vacant properties as well. Almost 1.2 miles of Pescadero Creek Road, and some of these county facilities I previously mentioned, the Cal Fire Station and the County Maintenance Yard. Martins Beach, with 4.9 feet of sea level rise, almost 50 of these homes are vulnerable or projected to be vulnerable to sea level rise. The 15 oceanfront homes are most vulnerable currently, and there is an existing coastal revetment that is, and this is one of the protection strategies that is often employed in adaptation that can help reduce the risk. But as you can see, there's also impacts of it occupying space that could otherwise be used for beaches and beach recreation. 19 of the 22 homes between Highway 1 and the coast are vulnerable with 4.2 erosion and or wave flooding, with 4.9 feet of sea level rise. And near Tunitas Creek, there's 6 privately owned cabins within 30 feet of the bluff edge. And you can see here a great example of erosion happening. The non-vegetated areas are areas that are already showing signs of erosion, and as sea level rise occurs and the waves start to undermine the toe of this slope, we'll expect to see a lot more erosion in the future. Oops, wrong way, sorry. We've also taken an initial look at some of the demographics and social vulnerabilities in the South Coast. Many of the South Coast residents are Latino farm workers and low-income families. Communities like Pescadero have several factors that make many of its residents socially vulnerable. Over 50% of the community is living below the federal poverty level. 35% of the community is living in overcrowded housing, and nearly all employees commute, making them dependent on roads in and out of Pescadero and on Highway 1. these considerations are really important for thinking how we want the communities to look in the future and for designing inclusive and equitable adaptation strategies that can provide benefits for all of the South Coast residents and visitors. By looking at the 2010 census data, we see that the total population is estimated at just under 13,000. With those populations, there's about 260 estimated people that live or reside in the sea level rise hazard areas, representing about 112 housing units. These households have limited English and represent about 5 or almost 6% of the total census block group population and about 11% of the Pescadero population. Now, this is really solely based on census block data from 2010. So it's a bit dated. We have not gotten the 2020 census results yet. But there's also a lot of other users of the South Coast. There's tribal communities, there's subsistence fishermen, low-income renters, a lot of out-of-town recreational users who come in on the weekends. There's agricultural leaseholders. None of these have been fully evaluated from a social vulnerability assessment, and there's need for some additional work once we get this 2020 census data. I want to focus now to some of the risk assessment results. So I'm going to talked about the land use and structures and facilities. Now we're going to move to sort of agriculture, which is a real underpinning to the South Coast community. And you know, there's kind of two major hazards that affect agriculture. Coastal erosion, you can see again, we have sort of developed open space, grazing and other, and then field crops. And the color-coded lands are those that are vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal erosion here. And overall, there's about 551 acres of agricultural lands that are exposed to the various sea level rise hazards that are accelerated with coastal erosion. Now, coastal erosion results in sort of the loss of some of this acreage, while this represents in Pescadero areas that are exposed to estuary or other forms of flooding that will also be impacted. Now, flooding is a natural process that occurs that actually can be beneficial to agricultural soils while bringing in new nutrients, more sediment into the soils. So we haven't been able to look at salinity and changes, but all of those floods events and the contribution of salinity can alter some of the soil chemistries and make them more or less productive over time. So this really looks at the exposure of each of these hazards to agriculture. I'm going to turn to transportation here. This is the end of Pescadero Road. You can see kind of erosion happening already in many cases. So overall, you can see some of the impacts again near Pescadero, where erosion will impact portions of Highway 1, the parking lot at Pescadero State Park and State Beach, where you overlook the lagoon and the opening, and then estuary flooding that can impact the water lane in the town of Pescadero. Overall, we found Highway 1, there's about 4.5 miles of highway at risk from coastal erosion, primarily cliff erosion. The sections at the greatest risk are, sort of described here and are shown in the larger scale maps that will be available very soon online. We also have 11 public parking lots, as well as many of the unofficial parking areas on the side of the road. Bean Hollow State Park parking lot is closed, for example, and people, on a busy weekend, it's a traffic jam because everybody's trying to pull off and get to the beach. So these are the kinds of hazards and kind of issues that we're going to have to try and adapt to improve the quality of life, improve and or maintain the quality of life along the South Coast. You can see here an example of a recently built revetment or piles of rock to reduce coastal erosion. Here we show the different parking lots in the state parks and some of the off-street lots and how much they're exposed in purple to wave and erosion. And you can see that in a lot of cases, a lot of them are exposed to wave initially and then erosion, but red shows that it's an erosion hazard. And in order to effectively adapt to these hazards, we need to address the causative hazard. So dealing with erosion takes different methods than dealing with coastal wave flooding, for example. Looking at the parks and recreation and coastal access, you can see that there's many miles of impacts along a lot of the coastal trails and beach access points. Bean Hollow here, for example, the bathroom and the parking lot is already exposed to coastal erosion and wave flooding during a major event, wave event. And in other places, portions of, say, Pigeon Point are exposed to with some of the more informal trails, but in the future, there could be other impacts to the facilities and recreational access. Here's another map of the Pescadero area showing those results. And again, we have these 3 maps with insets that kind of show the timing and impacts to trails and restrooms. So the Pigeon Point Lighthouse, with, again, these results are only reported for 4.9 feet of sea level rise to keep this these results as brief as possible. There's a lot more detail in the report about the timing and the elevation of sea level rise that you can look at and learn from. So the Pigeon Point Lighthouse is at risk from cliff erosion. There's almost 16 miles of trail, largely on state parkland that can constitute a good portion of the California Coastal Trail in the South County and into Half Moon Bay that are affected at different times. These bathrooms at these different state parks are all affected, 2 of them from wave flooding and 5 by erosion. Again, wave flooding causes a temporary impact and the facility may be usable after it's cleaned up. Erosion of a facility is pretty much a permanent loss. So that's why we need to think about how we adapt to these different hazards. There's also sensitive habitats and species. And while we haven't been able to map, given the cultural sensitivity, there are a tremendous amount of cultural and historically significant artifacts and places along the South Coast. And they include areas around Franklin Point and Año Nuevo, where shipwrecks and Native American burial grounds and village sites all exist. And a lot of these could be lost as sea level rises. So to sort of summarize these results, you know, really these key findings, really the biggest threat to the South Coast is to Highway 1. That is the access for both locals and residents and visitors alike, as well as to commerce, agricultural products, and need to get products to market. And so the commerce of the South Coast also depends on the connectivity along Highway 1. And the county is working actively with Caltrans to try and come up with solutions. Coastal access and recreation, some of those will be severely impacted. Some of the future of the impacts will be determined by the choices that the community and the county makes on how we address the erosion and wave flooding hazards into the future. The communities of Pescadero face several coastal estuary impacts and combined flooding hazards, and Martins Beach faces both wave and coastal erosion hazards into the future. cultural resources, particularly around Año Nuevo State Park, and those 5 significant facilities that I mentioned. The Cal Fire Station, which the county is already moving forward at relocating, the maintenance yard, Pigeon Point Lighthouse, the Gazzo's gas station, and brewery, if that's considered significant. I know it is for some people. And then there's also the Ritz-Carlton, which is a really important economic driver to the city of Half Moon Bay and to tourism in this area. Erosion, particularly cliff erosion, causes the highest exposure to all of these different sectors we've analyzed, and that habitats, it will be more information and work done on habitats and economic assessments. How many dollars are at risk from these vulnerabilities? There is future work that will be needed beyond this study. The location of water supply wells and surface storage ponds are not very well documented. We need better information on septic fields, locations of cultural resources. We can't really include, because of the sensitivity around vandalism, and given once we get the 2020 census data, getting a more detailed social vulnerability assessment may also provide some valuable information to support the communities on the South Coast and the economic livelihoods. And given the resolution of the available coastal models that we used, they're not necessarily perfectly suited for specific development purposes. If somebody's going to propose a new development, a new building, a new hotel or something right on the, within one of these existing models, there's probably much more detailed site-specific analysis that needs to occur to inform that permit and planning decision. So at that point, I'm going to pause. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a fire hose coming at you, but I'm open for questions. I'd love to hear if these results and vulnerabilities make sense, if anything surprised you, if you're like, yes, that's it, or there's all these other things, please. I think Hillary is going to facilitate that.
If people can raise your hand when you have questions, or we can drop the questions in the map. I now see a question coming from Catherine Peary. Is there a map of downtown Pescadero?
There is. Let me go back to a few. I can just use, let's see, I might just go to this one. Sorry. Reacting on the fly. Oh, we just use this one. Okay, so this shows kind of the extent in downtown Pescadero. And then this is sort of some of the insets.
Yeah, and we should note too that it's not directly downtown that's in that inset. That's just a little ways west and around that water lane intersection with Pescadero Creek Road. Downtown Pescadero just falls outside of that area, just because the elevation that it's at is just outside of that margin where that closed lagoon, which Dave can explain a little better if you like, where downtown would be affected.
And I will add that this is really a sea level rise study. So the local hazard mitigation planning effort is looking much more broadly at watershed and creek flood hazards that I know have affected Pescadero, the broader portion of Pescadero. This is where we anticipate the extent of sea level rise expanding the existing coastal hazards.
So Dave, there's another question that just came in the chat. Couple questions. How will this affect FEMA maps that are used by the county for development permits?
So FEMA right now has, they have recently updated their flood insurance rate maps, which affect flood insurance, that if you get a federally subsidized mortgage, you have to comply with the flood hazard maps and regulations and have flood insurance. But FEMA does not have any authorization to look at sea level rise or any climate change impacts. So these results will may be used by the county in the future to better inform future planning decisions, but the FEMA maps are the only regulatory map. Now, there are some efforts at the federal level to start to get advisory maps associated with FEMA maps, but those are not regulatory products right now.
And then the next question, will San Mateo and Santa Cruz counties be sharing data and plans given the businesses and other entities on the border? I can answer that one. Yes, we have been coordinating with the city and county of Santa Cruz, and we can make sure that they have this information. I know the city of Santa Cruz has been doing a lot of work in adaptation planning, and we can reach out to the county as well.
We've been working very closely with the city of Santa Cruz as well.
Right, integral. Dave is working on the work down there. The next question, are revetments and other riprap structures off the table as a defense? As far as I know, they cause more troubles up and down the coast of them. Well, I mean, we haven't taken anything off. We're really just exploring options and providing recommendations.
And I would add, we'll touch on this in the next section, but that is definitely a current approach. And as we adapt and make choices on how we adapt, we will use pretty much every tool we have in the toolbox. And coastal armoring will be one, but every strategy has trade-offs. And the community needs to evaluate those trade-offs in considering what approach and when that approach is implemented.
The next question, any idea about saltwater infusion into egglands?
That is a tricky one. We had hoped to be able to look at some of that. There isn't a lot of great data, and it will take a pretty sophisticated model to look at the saltwater intrusion into the aquifers. USGS has started some initial modeling of groundwater impacts. However, as we've observed in other locations along the California coast, the groundwater levels are really dependent on, really influenced by the barbelled estuaries. So Pescadero Marsh, when it closes, backs up water far beyond and affects groundwater inundation. A lot of the shallow aquifers in the South Coast are really rainfall dependent. And so looking for opportunities to recharge those, if we have a couple years of drought, those shallow aquifers tend to run pretty low. So it's really difficult to look at that with any of the available information.
And then the next, the FEMA maps were updated in 2012. Is there a newer map?
There are, I'm not sure exactly the year, but I know that since at least 2018, FEMA has been updating all of the coastal flood insurance rate maps for coastal hazards. So wave flooding particularly. I'm not sure and they all, for the entire state of California. So a lot of the preliminary maps that go through the county and go through reviews and before they become final published maps have been working through that process. I know that these have been updated. I think it was 2019 or that they were finalized. Matt may know off the top of his head, but you know, they have been updated, but the only updates to my knowledge are based on the wave hazards and the wave run up. And I know with the restoration on Butano Creek that there has not yet been a revised FEMA map.
Will state parks continue with the Pigeon Point Lighthouse renovation considering this report?
Well, we have been in conversation with state parks as part of this, part of the review and so we've shown these results to them, and they are, I believe, still proceeding with the renovations. Excuse me, the renovations. As to what kind of approaches they may take, or if they will be relocating anything as a result. That's sort of the next phase of this project where we look at adaptation. So, and we will be reaching out to them both to verify these results and to discuss with them approaches that they may be taking to integrate these results into their future planning and capital improvements.
Dave, the one thing I would mention, just to reiterate what you mentioned earlier too, is that for more site-specific level analysis, usually a separate model would be done. So the cliff hazard modeling that we're showing here is representative of a very large coastal area. It's really at a different type of scale. So I think that should be made pretty clear, and that there's also a general plan too that the park has done rather recently, where they've looked into a little bit greater depth of the erosion hazards there.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm not seeing any more questions. I think we can continue on.
Okay, now everybody can see what I did really quick. I try and catch up.
I just
Okay.
saw one more question come in. We'll come back to it after we get through this next section.
We can take one more quick question.
Okay. I think this question is around calculating tourist visitor traffic and amount tourists spend. And actually, I think this is being calculated in the economic assessment. Is that right, Dave?
That is correct. Yeah, we are going to be looking at both damages and economic revenues from different, from recreational users. So that is something we're working through, and we're still trying to get some review by the agencies, particularly state parks, around some of the assumptions we've had to make around recreational users and the types of users and things like that. So that will be included in the report when it comes out. But that's a good question. And it's kind of a good pass over to talking about adaptation, because there's a tendency to let's keep everything the same way, but over time that requires us to face the choice of how much do we spend to keep it the same way versus spending something to do something different that may save us money over the long term. This is sort of a very short initial discussion about adaptation approaches. We will be working more in the coming months to evaluate those and look at different costs and benefits of these different approaches to resolving some of these vulnerabilities. So there's sort of 4 different categories of adaptation approaches. One is to do nothing, which is a choice. 2 is to protect. And we can see here, this is an example from Monterey Bay of Stillwell Hall on Fort Ord, where they had placed a tremendous amount of riprap or revetments, coastal armoring, to protect the old officers club. And you can also accommodate, and that is typically done by coastal engineers and can show a lot of can provide a lot of benefits in the short term to protecting that structure. You can accommodate, so you can elevate structures, you can set them back further, you can require different building code requirements that make them more resilient. And then there's sort of retreat or relocation or realignment. The key word here is managed. This is how do we get out of the way gracefully? I often jest that only a fool picks a fight with the ocean, but how do we gracefully move back from hazardous or dangerous areas while still using them and enjoying them for what they are? some of our choices, and this is something I'll talk about in the next slide as well, but this picture, these two pictures are really, this picture here, which is Protect Stillwell Hall, was taken in 2002. It was turned over from the Department of Defense to became a national monument, and the revetment was removed, which allowed erosion to continue. They took out this structure, and in just 3 years, the beach is back. So one of the choices we often have between different adaptation strategies is what consequences or trade-offs are we willing to accept? To continue to protect this would have required a lot more investment and more rock around the side, and soon this would have been a peninsula, rather than relocating this and allowing the beach to come back. So it kind of brings me up to secondary impacts. Or consequences of these adaptation choices. There's construction costs to consider, initial construction costs of building something new or building something in the same place. There's escalating maintenance cost, kind of illustrated by that last the last pictures at Stillwell Hall, where you're going to have to spend more to keep things the same over time. There's impacts to ecology, as is sort of illustrated in this example. And I want to say that seawalls, a vertical seawall or a riprap revetment at an angle, all have an impact. They have a footprint of that structure that buries sands on the beach. It affects biodiversity. It affects endangered species habitat. It affects recreation, towel space, the ability to just walk along the beach. You could see in this last example, you couldn't walk along this beach. And then once the revetment was out, you could. There's also a change in the views. In some cases, you build a wall, but then as sea level rises, it becomes more and more exposed, and you have to raise the wall until you lose your views from your kitchen window. There's aesthetics considerations, but there's also a displacement of the underrepresented communities. With these huge record-setting heat waves, we're already seeing a lot of climate refugees coming from the Central Valley, coming from inland areas to the coast for our natural air conditioner. And if we take away some of these free or low-cost recreational areas, we're displacing them again. So we're losing low-cost recreation. We're also losing potential tourism-related revenues, agricultural-related revenues when we lose some of these different resources. So these all sort of need to be put into the consideration and calculation of what makes sense to do over time. As we go, there's certain, we are probably going to use all of these approaches. In some places, the best thing to do is nothing, because we're going to lose a little bit of bluff habitat or something that's been, already taken off the, not really used, or it's just open space. We'll protect something for a while, but at some point it stops to make sense to just continue to pour money down, something with escalating maintenance cost. So then we may take a different approach. As we decide when do we go from protect to setting things back or realigning Highway 1 or whatever, we're going to make choices based on things we can easily measure. And I call these things triggers. So we can say, well, when sea level rise gets to 2 feet, we need to start doing something, or we need to trigger a study that will tell us how and lead us to a different adaptation approach. We could look at the rate of sea level rise. In a natural system, beaches, will keep up with sea level rise. If erosion happens in the cliffs, the beaches can sort of maintain, and it just kind of goes up. But at some point, if sea level rise happens too fast, that same sort of equilibrium with the beach width and the erosion doesn't keep up. And so we'll start to lose beaches, and that may be a high priority. We could specify something by time, by exposure. I mean, how frequently does Pescadero Road flood and require cleaning? If it's once every 10 years, or once every 5 years, or once every year, or once every high tide, somewhere in there is a trigger point where we're going to want to do something different so that we can maintain emergency access, commerce, and access to homes. Distance, what's the distance between the coastal trail or Highway 1 between the cliff edge? When a damage is damaged multiple times or damaged by a certain percentage, maybe we choose to do a different strategy. And by cost, you know, money doesn't grow on trees. And so at some point, maybe the county spends $1 billion and then we're like, okay, maybe we need to do something different. These are all examples of triggers that we want to try and tease out and help the county and the communities identify in advance so that we can set changes in course ahead so that when we see something gets exposed, say from, I'll try and use an example of, say when, you know, the distance between the cliff edge and Highway 1 is 10 feet, and it's going to take 10 years to come up with a plan to realign that segment, then we need to start 10 years in advance before that erosion hits it. And so we use these triggers and consider how long it will take to plan, finance, permit, and implement an adaptation strategy before Highway 1 becomes a one-lane road for a decade. So that's part of this planning process that we'll be proceeding in, and that's part of the discussion we really want to have tonight in these breakout groups. Hillary, back to you.
Great. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. We did just get a couple questions that came in. What is Caltrans' approach to Highway 1 failing? Are you partnering with them? And we did meet with Caltrans as part of the project, and I can let Dave chime in too. We also met with the Coastal Commission recently, and they explained that as part of the permit for putting the rock on the beach, Caltrans is required to come up with a long-term strategy for Highway 1, and they're in the process of applying for grant funding for that.
Yeah, I would just say that right now, in the short term, Caltrans is protecting the roadways. There are some culverts they're particularly concerned about that may fill with sand as the beaches migrate inland that could cause additional washouts and damages. We've all experienced the one-lane closures on different aspects from different damages. And so Caltrans is aware of different approaches. They've looked at some different alignments of a realigned Highway 1. None of them are fantastic, but they're starting that process. And they are definitely aware of this study.
The next question is really understanding about how emissions ties to sea level rise amounts. So if we are able to take action to really reduce emissions, will we still expect to see 4.9 feet of sea level rise along the coast in 2100?
That is a great question.
I can answer it a little bit. So I know that we are, based on our current levels of emissions, we've already have a certain amount of sea level rise that is going to occur. However, one reason why I think it was important for Dave to mention the fact that the emissions amounts affect the projections are that we do have some agency in the future of sea level rise by reducing emissions as much as we can.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good answer.
I think the exact amount, I don't, I think we can reduce that amount, but I have to look into the details of exactly how much we've already committed to and when it will happen.
I mean, I just want to put a little bit of in context, and that is that there are a lot of dynamic feedback loops in the Earth climate atmosphere connection. So I think about climate change and global warming as the emissions are putting more layers of blanket around the Earth, trapping more heat. As we emit more, the blanket gets thicker. The thickness of that blanket has other ramifications or other consequences of increasing temperature in the atmosphere, absorbing that into the oceans. And all of those have different lag times. The emissions that have been emitted already have cooked in centuries of sea level rise. So if we were to turn off greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to be facing centuries of sea level rise, period. Unless we can somehow figure out how to capture that carbon and put it or reuse it somewhere else. So sea level rise, these numbers that we use, the uncertainty in the range is really about the timing of when we'll see it. There is very little doubt in my mind that we'll see at least 4.9 and feet of sea level rise by 2100, if not much more. So, but I think it's really important to think about this not as we have to do this, we can't get to some parts per million in the atmosphere. We need to think about reducing our emissions and that peak of emissions and moving it closer to us in time, and then dealing with the consequences of what we've already committed.
Great. So I think we should do one more question with 2 more questions coming in. So we have a little bit of time before the breakout rooms. The next question, I thought sea level rise was region specific. Is the South Coast one kind of region for this modeling? I can answer that, and Dave, you can take a stab.
Sure, go ahead, Hillary.
One of the main things that changes throughout California is the amount that land is rising or sinking. So in some parts of the north part of the state, land is actually rising. So that reduces the amount of sea level rise we experience. So the California state guidance divides the state into regions, and it's north, and then there's a central region around San Francisco, and those are the projections that we're using. And then there's south, I believe. So we're kind of lumped together in the central area, and the land, there's not a lot of really specific data around how much land is moving, but for general purposes, the amount of sea level rise we're going to experience here from that perspective and for modeling is for that area, for the whole kind of central coast area. Anything to add to that?
There is the relative sea level rise, which Hillary talked about, and then there's the different hazard models, which are also used. They require different assumptions about waves and precipitation changes and temperature changes, and all that gets fed into the model outputs. And we've spent a lot of time combing through the models, looking at the assumptions and sort of evaluating the best available science today that's available to make these projections.
And then another question is local ocean temperature expected to increase and to cause the water to expand?
Yes.
Excellent.
Without going into any more details.
Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. We can continue to answer questions in the breakout rooms too. So, Isabel, are you going to give a little overview of the breakout group next steps?
Yes, and we will have about 20 minutes to have a group conversation that we really wanted to be focused on adaptation solutions. What do you want to see happening in the South Coast to minimize the risks of coastal hazards that we have discussed today? So see you all in about 20 minutes.